Okay, so as you read in some of the documents that we read in class the other day, one part or one consequence of the English and the Spanish establishing empires is the growth of the Atlantic slave trade. So let's look at some background. As you remember, I'm sure from ninth grade history, slavery has existed since civilization existed. However, back then, if one Greek city-state fought another Greek city-state and they took the losers as their captive slaves, there was no racial difference, right, between owner and slave. There was, and then, but in Africa, the Islamic or the Muslim African slave trade has existed from about 650 CE to 1600s. And the Muslims that captured much of North Africa, it was okay to enslave non-Muslims. However, there was more social mobility and more rights at this point in the Muslim African slave trade. If you recall from the Ottoman Empire, remember that was a slave bureaucracy, but it often included social mobility and power. So what's different this time? So even though slavery has existed since history began, this time with the Atlantic slave trade, slavery is now based solely on race. And we'll talk about the long-term implications of that. Okay, so the causes of African slavery. So why bring Africans to the Americas? So as you can imagine, the Native American population was dying from the labor on the encomiendas, the plantations and the mines, and smallpox, of course, is just decimating the population. So the Europeans get the idea to get, since the slave trade was existing already in North Africa, they get the idea of bringing the slaves over because they have been having contact with Europeans for centuries. So they're exposed to those diseases. Also, Africans had had the farming experience, unlike the Native Americans. And frankly, they couldn't escape, right? A lot of Native Americans could escape off the plantations and the mines and hide because Europeans don't know where they're going. But the Africans won't know the landscape and they won't know their way. So, Spain is the country that begins importing Africans to the Americas. Soon, with the establishment of Brazil and a lot of the sugar plantations, Portugal then starts to participate. And notice 40% of all Africans at this time went to Brazil alone. And the English then made money off the slave trade, the business of the slave trade. And so this is one of their diagrams you recall from the textbook. So this is how the English made money. They would take the slaves into the Americas, and you can, I don't know, this to me is one of the most revealing documents. Do they Are the English thinking of these as human beings? Do you put human beings like this in a boat? So we can see the troubling aspect of the Atlantic slave trade. So the question then is, what role did African rulers play in the slave trade? Well, at this point in Africa, and the Europeans are exploiting this, there's a lot of unrest, a lot of wars going on between different African societies, different kingdoms. And so a lot of times different groups would trade their enemies into the hands of the Europeans to get rid of their rivals, to get rid of their competition, and then making money off of them. So everybody's guilty, I guess, in this. So here is, I think, a revealing map. So we're looking at the slave trade here from 1650 to 1860. And so 10 to 15 million enslaved people were transported from Western Africa to the Americas. And even though I think slavery and the implications of slavery have played such an important role in the development of our nation, look at the numbers here, right? Just a small percentage of African slaves came to what will be the United States, right? So most go to the West Indies because of sugar, and of course most come here to Brazil. because the sugar, coffee, these are high labor, or I should say labor intensive goods, right? These are crops that take a lot of manpower. There's no machines, you have to do this by hand, and they needed a lot of people because by this point sugar was no longer a luxury, right? Europeans felt that it was a necessity. And so that was the hunger for sugar was was a driving force between the slave trade. So I'll let you ponder this map for a little bit and see what it reveals. Okay, so we start to see something known as the triangular trade. And this is an important vocabulary word for you to know, and it's the transatlantic trade network. And as you can tell by those arrows, that a triangle is formed. So you would see the raw goods coming out of the Americas: sugar, coffee, and tobacco. So this would come into Europe, they would make stuff out of it and sell it to the Africans. So textiles, brandy, and guns. From Africa, of course, they traded the slaves. So this becomes known as the Middle Passage. So these are two vocabulary terms you should know: the triangular trade and the Middle Passage. So anytime on a map, say on the test, right, you would recognize the triangular trade that exists between the Americas, Europe, and Africa. And the term of the Middle Passage is the slave trade. Okay, so what was life like for Africans in the Americas? Well, I don't need to tell you, it was not awesome. So here are some documents, pictures from this time of a slave auction, right? Slaves in the fields working in the Americas. And then we see this enormous impact on the Americas because we suddenly have this influx of people from a different continent. And one benefit is the influx of the people and their culture and their traditions, which then soon become a part of the Americas and the American culture. There was also, of course, rebellions, if you can tell what's happening here. We never can assume just because people are taken like this that they're just going to go along with it, right? This was a horrific experience, and they fought back many times. However, there is only one successful slave rebellion in 1804, and we'll talk about that later. So let's look at the consequences of the slave trade, which are enormous, right? So on Africa, there's a loss of generation, right? You're not taking the old and the sick from Africa, you're taking the young, the healthy, the workforce. So you lose this entire generation to the slave trade. The splitting up of families, right, has enormous consequences, as families are not only split up in Africa, but once they get to the Americas, they are often sold to different owners. And of course, the introduction of guns. I mentioned earlier that this was a time in the late 1500s, early 1600s, was a time of conflict in the continent of Africa. So you can imagine the introduction of guns did not help that. So what is the consequence on the Americas? Well, the Africans brought with them agricultural expertise. Their labor, of course, helped the colonies survive. They would not have made it if not for slave labor. And we also see then an influx of their culture that starts to blend into then American culture. Okay, and last here is a population mixture. So a while back we looked at the triangle of the social classes with the peninsulares on top, if you remember, and we'll talk more about that. So all of a sudden then there's a new group of people lower on the totem pole, if you will, and they start to be a blending, right, between Africans and Europeans, Africans and Native Americans. And so we start to see then a mixture of the population that, of course, the legacy is evident today in North and South America. So we'll talk more about this in class. So bring some questions if you have them.